Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One-to-One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak with each one-to-one. It's been 60 years since the spectrum of disorders known as autism was initially described and noted by psychiatrists. Even today, there's no consensus on what it is or what causes it. If anything, there are more questions, more theories, more contentions, more blame, and more guilt. Dr. Cecelia McCarton is a nationally known pediatrician and researcher who specializes in diagnosing and treating children with developmental disorders through her Center for Developmental Pediatrics. The school division serves children with autism and autistic spectrum disorders, and her foundation is dedicated to improving the lives of those children and their families. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It was big news recently when it was announced that a 1998 study linking childhood vaccinations to autism has been debunked. What do you think is going to be the impact of that announcement?
I think things will pretty much stay the way they are. There are parents who firmly believe in their heart that their children suffered a regression when they received vaccines. And they will absolutely continue to believe that. It's a very emotional issue, very emotional. People look for a reason why things happen.
Right.
And as human beings, we always seek that.
Have a lot of parents opted out of having their children vaccinated because of that study?
Many, many, many. And it's reached a state where sometimes these childhood illnesses that we hadn't seen in a very, very long time, like measles and mumps, are on, they're resurging again because people are opting not to vaccinate their children.
One thing we know for sure, though, is that the incidence of autism in the American population has increased dramatically over the last generation. I think I read a figure that one in 150 children is born who is later diagnosed with autism. Is that an accurate figure, or do we know how many?
It's actually 1 in 100 now.
Really?
And that's from the Center for Disease Control. These are the statistics that come from them. They're a fairly conservative group of individuals. But we don't know why. We have no idea why. The feeling now is that clearly there has to be some genetic reason. There has to be some genetic predisposition, just as there is with any disease. Why does one member of the family get cancer and another doesn't get cancer? So there must be some genetic predisposition. But then on top of that, now we're beginning to suspect that perhaps there's some kind of environmental trigger that tips the scales and allows these children to become autistic or to be born autistic. But it's a complicated genetic picture. Now they're saying it maybe takes 20 genes to come together before you would really even have some of the symptoms of autism.
So how is autism defined? What is it?
It's a neurological disorder, that's for sure, but there's no test for it. There's no blood test, there's no x-ray, there's no biochemical test that can be done. It's really defined behaviorally. So these children have usually 3 distinct areas where they have some difficulty. One is really in language. They have a very difficult time either communicating and or understanding language. Also, they have difficulty with social interactions. And the third thing is that their main interests are usually very focal, very circumscribed, sometimes very ritualistic. So their play elements are really off.
Is it something that evolves over time? Does it get worse? Does it?
There's 2 types of presentation. Some parents will say that they knew from a very early age after their child was born that there was really something off. The child wasn't making eye contact, or the child was extremely irritable or cranky and didn't like to be cuddled. That's about 2/3 of the children. a third of the children appear to be completely normal until they're somewhere between 1 and 2 years of age. And then somehow they begin to lose their skills. They lose language, they lose eye contact, they're not so much interested in interacting with their parents. And that's a third of the children.
Right.
So the presentations are somewhat different. Is it just that one is an early presentation and one is a late presentation? Right. We don't know. We really don't know, because we don't know the cause.
Right. I think the presentations that most people are familiar with are, as you mentioned, the child's inability to focus on anything, right. Very short attention span, or can only focus on certain things, limited things, and also the inability to connect to people.
Yes.
You know, including their parents.
Yes.
Don't make eye contact, don't, as you said, don't cuddle, you know, don't, are not sort of on the periphery
right.
of the family's interaction. Are there also more extreme symptoms, for instance, temper tantrums or lashing out or that kind of thing?
Yes, you have to remember it's a spectrum. So that even though a child may get this diagnosis, he may not really be like the child next to him who gets this diagnosis. So it truly is a spectrum. There are some children who typically look like what most people imagine autistic children would look like. Very severe presentation, they're isolated, they're rocking, they're focusing in maybe on the lint on the rug, can't talk, can't understand. But there's another whole side to autism where there are children who do make eye contact with their parents, who do like to be cuddled by their parents, but they have an inability to communicate by language. They're not so much interested in anybody else except their parents, and they do have these circumscribed interests.
Also in the news was a report that one of the incubators of autism is in the womb. That if a woman has a second or third child too soon after the previous child, autism may be the result. Now, is that too soon after any child or too soon after an autistic child?
They were really talking about timing of having children in general, not necessarily linking it to having an autistic child. But you know, there have been many theories like this that have come out. There's one that the older male is more prone to give birth to children who are on the spectrum. Women who are under stress are more prone to give birth to children who are autistic. And these usually come about because there are these huge epidemiological studies that are done, and some of these points really pop up. What they mean, we really have absolutely no idea. We do know, though, that if you do have an autistic child, that there's probably anywhere from a 7 to 10% chance of having another autistic child, whether that be male or female.
How about smoking or drinking during pregnancy? Has there been any link?
No, there hasn't been any link to this.
Doctors often speak of autistic children as being trapped inside a prison. Is that accurate in your view?
I think some children are trapped. There are some children who really understand what you're saying, but they really can't communicate. They're not good with their expressive language or formulating what they want to say. There are some children who have enormous talents that really don't come out until much later, and people really literally think that these are children who are cognitively delayed and really don't have very much potential. We just did a wonderful evening at Carnegie Hall called the Genius of Autism. And we had performers who were on the spectrum who came out and they entertained, and there were singers and there were artists and there were athletes and there were poets. And these are individuals who are on the spectrum but clearly have enormous talents.
Now, when I was growing up, there's a lot of talk about retarded children. And now, and maybe it's a politically correct kind of thing, there is much less talk about retarded children and a lot of talk about autistic children. Are they the same thing or are they different?
They're different. Children who are mentally retarded usually are extremely interested in others and really do try to engage. with others. Sometimes they can speak, sometimes they can't speak. But their level of functioning is just depressed, if you will, in comparison to others. With autistic children, you're really dealing with a very specific constellation of symptoms. There's a language component, there's a social component, there's a myopic interest component, there's lack of play, and so it's a very different kind of presentation. Now, many autistic children, when they have standardized cognitive testing done on them, come out with scores that are in the mentally retarded range. The problem there is that these standardized tests were never devised for children who don't have language. Mm-hmm. So, of course, if you don't have language or you're not understanding language, your scores are going to be very low, and perhaps they are going to be in the retarded range, but it's not a true representation of the child. We really don't know how many children who are on the spectrum really do have serious cognitive delays so that they would be deemed mentally retarded. We have no idea about that.
So when you talk about the children who are trapped in this prison, are there treatments, therapies that can help them break out?
Well, you know, when you don't have a cause of something, it's very, very hard to find an effective treatment. Right. So that's the first thing. What we do know is that there are some ways that we can certainly teach autistic children, and those have been honed very, I think, quickly over the past maybe 15 years or so. Probably the main thrust of teaching autistic children is with a type of teaching called applied behavioral analysis, ABA therapy. It's one-on-one teaching. The activity is broken down to the least common denominator. The child masters that, and then you build the next brick on top of that. But it's a pervasive disorder, so that you need a comprehensive approach to this, very intense and also consistent. So you have a language delay, you need a language component, a language intervention. You have perhaps some cognitive learning delays, you need a teaching component. Sometimes these children have real difficulty with their motor function, their fine motor function, their hands, sometimes their gross motor function. So you need a motor component to it. They have difficulty socializing, you need a social component to it. So you can see that you're attacking this from every single possible angle. The most important thing is early intervention. The earlier you get a child, the more you can do. That's the beauty of early intervention. And the later you get a child, there are behaviors that have become learned and fixed, and it becomes much more difficult to really try to reshape some of those behaviors and reshape the learning process.
We're going to take a short break, then we'll be back with more with Dr. Cecelia McCarton, founder and executive director of the McCarton Center for Developmental Disabilities.
Secondhand smoke kids breathe in smoke that can have as much nicotine and carbon monoxide as what's inhaled by a smoker. About half of secondhand smoke kids have cancer-causing chemicals in their bodies. They suffer more frequent and severe asthma attacks, and some studies even show a link to learning problems. Don't raise a secondhand smoke kid. Quit smoking today. For help, call 311.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Dr. Cecelia McCarton, founder and executive director of the McCarton Center for Developmental Disabilities. Before the break, we were talking about therapies for dealing with autism and all of the different angles at which you have to come at it, depending on what the child's disabilities are. I assume that you do all of these at your school.
We do.
Tell me about your school.
Our school is down in Chelsea, and it's in a wonderful old Catholic school that had been abandoned. It's 100 years old. It's a one-to-one school, meaning that there's one teacher for each child. There's a lower school that goes from 3 to 12, and then there's an upper school that goes from 12 to 18. We try to look at autism as a complete package because it is pervasive, and it does cut across every single developmental area. So the children in the course of the day, and the day is from 9 to 5, it goes from 9 to 5, but the children will receive ABA therapy, which is applied behavioral analysis. They'll receive speech and language. They'll receive occupational therapy. They have social interaction. They have some group learning. We get them out into the community so that there's generalization of what they learn. And that's pretty much what takes up the whole day.
Right. Very intensive, very comprehensive, and this is a private school, probably pretty expensive. For a parent who has an autistic child, do they even have a chance in a public school setting?
They do, if the public school setting is really geared to the kinds of teaching that these children need. New York City does have a charter school for autistic children. It's the New York City Charter School for Autism, and it's a lottery system. So
where's that located?
It's up in the hundreds on the east side.
And how many children? Do you know how many?
I believe there might be 30 or less.
Okay.
In that. The beauty of that is that it's within a public school setting, so that they have their own classrooms, but they also they have the opportunity to have some mainstream activities if the children are able to with their peers. So that's a wonderful, wonderful setup. There are programs in the New York City school system where the children do get one-on-one teaching, and those are available. Parents really scout around, they shop, they try to find out what's best for their children. But there certainly are opportunities within the New York City school system that a child with autism can absolutely have an intervention program and be helped.
I would imagine that that many children with the right therapy begin to develop and interact more than anticipated.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, you will see a different child after intervention and during intervention. You'll see a child that suddenly starts emerging, and they start coming out, and parents really marvel at this. And that's the wonder of intervention, as long as we get the children early enough.
Right. Now, Asperger Syndrome is an example of the more high-functioning
yes.
Autistic person. I admit that I watch America's Next Top Model, and one of the models on one of the recent seasons had Asperger Syndrome.
Yes.
You know, and obviously she could go through, finish school, she could compete on America's Next Top Model, but she had difficulty in her relationships with people. It was very awkward.
That's correct.
In that sense.
The autistic or individuals with autism usually have no difficulty with language. In fact, when they're younger, they sound like little professors. They have very good language skills. But their difficulty is really with the social interactions, in really reading body language, reading in between the lines when somebody says something. They're very concrete. And so it becomes difficult for them because when you go through life, you're just not interpreting words. You're interpreting somebody's eyes, how they hold their head, the way they move their body. And many of these things are really lost on these individuals.
What don't most people know about autistic children?
Well, the first thing that most people forget about autistic children is that they're children. And they have the same kinds of interests in many ways as other children. They really do like to do things, and they really do like to get out. The other thing that people forget about autistic children is that this is not a hopeless diagnosis. This is not, oh my goodness, we can't change anything. This is the way he's going to be for life. because with early intervention now and the intensity of intervention, you can really change the face of autism. You may not be able to cure it, but you can certainly bring that child to a different level of functioning than before. And the other thing that people forget about children with autism is that often they have strengths. Sometimes what happens is that when you have a disorder, people always focus in on the negative. They always focus in on what you can't do because that's what you're always trying to correct or to make better. But many of these children have enormous, enormous strengths. Their memory is phenomenal. Some of them really are extremely good at mechanical things. They're fantastic with computers and able to really do many, many things on computers. Some of them have artistic talent. And so there really are people in there. There really are children within these bodies, and that sometimes we really forget that. We don't appreciate it.
Computers have been effective in some cases in doing that, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, many children who have difficulty understanding language, if you put them in front of a computer, and computers always break things down, and there's always a reward from computers, bells go off or balloons fly in the air, the children can really more readily learn from that kind of a presentation than from an oral presentation. So many times we'll use computers in terms of teaching children. What you have to be careful of with computers, though, is the generalization of what the child learns. Sometimes a child can really learn how to do something on a computer, but if you present it in a different kind of way or with different materials, there's a lack of generalization. And that's one of the major things you really have to fight against with autism.
How many children are at your school?
We have 30 children in the lower school, and we have 11 children now in the upper school. We just started the upper school in September, and we'll probably go up to maybe about 20 or 25 children in the upper school. What
kinds of genuine breakthroughs have you seen in your work with children there?
Well, I can tell you that there are children who came to us who really couldn't say a word, and people had absolutely given up on them. And after several years, sometimes 3-4 years of intensive work, they began to speak. I can tell you that there are children who really were not interested in other people. They were very happy and content to be by themselves. And now they have a buddy. And they like to sit next to somebody at lunch, and they really like to figure out what that person is doing, and they like to play with that individual. There are some children who came to us who had very inappropriate behaviors in that they had tantrums all the time and they couldn't walk across the floor without falling down, or if you changed one thing in the schedule, they became very, very upset. And these children are now regulated. They can go out and they can go to restaurants and they can be with their families and they can go on vacations. They can be part of the family.
Do you have autistic people who are going to be able to function independently?
Yes, absolutely. Again, it's a spectrum. We have a class of children in our school that are reading, they do math, they write little book reports, they have a science project, they're doing their history lessons. These are children who have been with us for 4 or 5 years who obviously have done very, very well, and these children are going to go back to their schools, and they'll be able to function within their school districts.
But how about when, you know, an autistic child reaches 18, in terms of living independently of their parents, in an apartment or in, perhaps in a group setting? Is that something that happens?
It does happen. Remember, there's a range, there's a spectrum within autism. So you have this young lady who's trying out to be America's next top model, obviously living independently,
right,
and doing very, very well. And yes, there are many individuals who are on the spectrum who can do this. There are other individuals that are going to need some assistance. And so maybe they'll live in group homes and get some assistance in that way. One of the real things that has to be tackled now is really the teenager, the young adult with autism. All the emphasis, for the most part,
has been on children.
Has been on children, exactly. And quite honestly, we're facing a tsunami. This wave of older individuals is sweeping across us, and people really don't have any idea what to do, how to go about giving vocational training, how to have meaningful jobs,
right,
where these individuals should live. I mean, clearly they're going to have a normal lifespan, and they can't spend their life going bowling or going to the movies every day. They have to have a reason to get up in the morning. They have to have a job. And so this is the things that we're really beginning to tackle right now in terms of how to go about this, how to bring meaning into the lives of these individuals.
So that's a real challenge for the country among all the others that we're facing right now.
We have many challenges in this country, but the numbers of autistic children really almost move this higher up on the list because this is something that is not going to go away.
Right. We're out of time. I want to thank Dr. Cecelia McCarton for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about her work, please visit the McCarton Center's website, mccartoncenter.com. For the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.